didn't invent this term, but I have been using a term very loudly on LinkedIn, which is my favorite platform because Twitter still kind of scares me and I'm still getting used to it. But I've been using this term hopium and hashtagging it. And that's exactly what people generate. They generate, what they do is they take people's hope, often, hope in a future that's desirable, and they pervert it in such a way, they weaponize it, they turn it into a drug that is used to basically shut off either the investor or the government's rational faculties and disconnect them from the thing that controls whether or not they open up their wallet and give them money. And there's so much hopium dealing and pushing and selling going on in the world right now. It's just mad. And some of it is related to the thing that I'm most interested in, which is decarbonization, decarbonizing our economy, which I think is an existential thing that we have to get on doing. And I've been disappointed through my entire career, all 31 years of it, that we've done so little about it so far. I figured we'd have had it licked by now, and we could have, honestly, had we been serious, but we weren't serious. So anyway, there's so much hopium dealing and pushing in relation to decarbonization. And it's just, people selling ideas that are just foolishness, that make no thermodynamic sense, that make no economic sense. And yet, and people in the same conference selling the diametric opposite. I'll give you an example of what. So you get these people that think that they're going to have giant amounts of renewable electricity in excess of what the market will need. And that's likely to be true in the future. And it's actually a good thing. It's something we want to encourage because it'll drive down the prices of electricity, renewable electricity, and hence permit the decarbonization to happen when we get smart about how to use those things. But these people are worried that the local grid, for instance, won't be able to use their electricity as electricity. And they think storage is expensive. So instead, what they want to do is they want to electrolyze water to make hydrogen to move the product to where people need it, because that might be easier than getting the grid rebuilt or something. I'm not sure exactly why, because it would mean that you'd have to build pipelines that don't exist and so on, which is no easier than upgrading the grid, but fine. Well, then they realize that there are no pipelines and they can't ship it by truck, and liquefying it to ship it by sea is kind of insane. So what they start thinking about is, well, what if I get some CO2 from somewhere and I run this reaction that's called methanation, where I take CO2 and I react it with hydrogen and I make methane and water, like worthless water, and a lot of heat that's being produced in a place where I have excess energy because I have electricity in excess already, so the heat's wasted too. So they want to run methanation reactions to make methane, because then they can shove that into the natural gas grid and people will buy it. Okay, so you see the story, right? We have excess energy and then we're going to make hydrogen, but no, hydrogen's no good, so we're going to make methane. And then so that's over here, that's in this place. And over there are these guys that have biogas, from anaerobic digestion of animal waste or waste food or whatever. And they have biogas and they want to get it to market, but nobody seems to want it because it's got all this CO2 in it. So they think, nobody seems to want our methane. How about we make hydrogen out of it? Because it'll be renewable hydrogen. There's no fossil CO2 associated with it. We'll make hydrogen and we'll just vent all the CO2 or whatever we'll do with it. So in one place, you've got people that have methane that's renewable, but can't get it to market. So they want to make hydrogen because hydrogen's sexy for some reason or other. Then you got other people over here that realize that hydrogen might be sexy, but it's kind of worthless if you can't get it to somebody that wants to buy it. And they're doing this, and they're both selling investors on these concepts, and they're mutually exclusive. Either one is dumb or the other's dumb, or they're both dumb, right? This is what I mean by hopium dealing and pushing and whatever. And if it was private money, I'd be 100% behind it, right?
Yeah.
But it's public money. It's
But
government money that's being siphoned up.
But it's so interesting because I read your article about hopium. I really enjoyed it. So just another part I wanted to ask about that subject is that you have like a line. I think it's like Edison. You have like
Yep.
chasing the perfect battery is a fool's journey. And I think
and
maybe
penny and a natural tendency to exploit the stupidity of human beings or something like that for profit. And this is the reality of batteries too. I mean, batteries are amazing. I love batteries. Batteries are super efficient, and the invention of the lithium-ion battery was great. But the thing that really made the lithium-ion battery amazing was the fact that everybody had one of these, a cell phone that needed a battery. And as a consequence of that need, they were willing to pay $3,000 a kilowatt hour for the initial batteries, because they gave your cell phone enough life to make it useful, right? And that carried them to the scale necessary to get their cost per kilowatt hour down low enough that you could imagine doing things like grid storage or electric vehicles with them. But the problem with batteries is, what do you hear in the media every day, a new invention that's going to revolutionize batteries, and then you never hear about it again. Why? Because it's not a revolutionary thing. It's some lazy journalist didn't bother to ask the question. Okay, so this battery, what's the cycle life? What's the cost per kilowatt hour? What's the fire risk? What's the current density? What's the energy density per unit volume? Nobody's asking the questions because the people that are involved in doing the journalism work aren't journalists. And even the ones that are journalists aren't scientists. So they don't know what questions to ask. So
basically this cocktail is like the fuel for greenwashing, right? And greenwashing is like the number one story globally. Yeah. So you have a huge problem from the engineer standpoint or the math guy with this like wave of greenwashing. So how do you go through the noise and separate good math from bad math, essentially?
So a bunch of us coalesced around the problem of the overselling of hydrogen. Okay, so hydrogen is one of these things that's really interesting, because it's at the same time, it's an existentially important decarbonization problem that we must solve if we want to keep eating and not destroy the planet. Okay, so we have to make hydrogen to make ammonia, because we need to feed half the people on the earth that we wouldn't feed without the ammonia as a fertilizer. And right now we make all of that ammonia from hydrogen that we make from natural gas or coal with no carbon capture, because that's cheap and the atmosphere is a free sewer. So hydrogen is an essential thing for us to fix as a decarbonization problem in the world. And it's a decarbonization problem right now that's basically, it's bigger than the aviation industry. It's bigger than shipping as a carbon source, just making hydrogen. And yet, at the same time, you've got people pushing hydrogen as a decarbonization solution to all kinds of problems like air transport and trucks, and as a home heating fuel and various other things, a way to store electricity. And this idea is being pushed well past its limits, the limits of sense. And so a bunch of people who didn't have any skin in the game money-wise, but had the knowledge to know that this pushing was going on, that this wasn't real, that this was mostly, people that were looking at a future in which their business was gone, like, for instance, selling natural gas. In the future, there won't be anybody selling natural gas because we won't be able to emit the CO2 from burning all of that natural gas, which isn't natural, it's fossil, right? So those people need to sell something, ergo hydrogen, and they're pushing it. And the same thing with there are a lot of earnest people interested in decarbonization that are making wind turbines and electrolyzers and fuel cells and so on. And they see a business opportunity of selling the idea of using hydrogen as a fuel. And so their economic interests are very clear, but the real question is this in the interest of decarbonization? And the answer is yes, if it's done right, and no, if it's done wrong. And the done wrong part is really simple. Are you using hydrogen as a fuel? Then you're doing it wrong.
But
so anyway, a bunch of us coalesced around this idea that hydrogen was being pushed inappropriately and that public money was being used inappropriately to fund it. And we formed something called the Hydrogen Science Coalition. I'm one of the founding members. And we're all people that rare birds. We know what we're talking about, and we don't have any money in it. Okay? We're not frothing at the mouth saying hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen because we're making a buck from it. And that's hard to find. But we're just basically standing there saying, look, we're these people. Here are our credentials. Journalists, please, if you get a story about hydrogen, don't just talk to the Shell and the Hydrogen Council and the guys frothing at the mouth about this stuff. Talk to us, and we'll give you the other side of the story, and we'll help you make sense of it. So that's what we can do about it.
Yeah, it's a good thing I'm talking to you now. At least I'll do my little help here. But I think just to close the hydrogen chapter, can you just also use the Swiss Army knife analogy, because maybe for people, but I think that's so relevant, right? Because
this
if
is
people
so
are
beautiful.
Yeah,
I love it when things work out like this. So people have been using this, and they've been saying that hydrogen is the Swiss Army knife of energy, right? Because it's so versatile. And it turns out that they're absolutely right. Hydrogen is the Swiss Army knife of energy. It's too expensive, and it's pretty much useless for just about every application you might put it to, except in an emergency. So when you're going camping, it's nice to have a Swiss Army knife because it sort of works as a knife, and it sort of works as a screwdriver, and maybe a corkscrew or this or that, right? But it's not the optimal tool for any of those tasks. And if you were at home, you wouldn't reach for your Swiss Army knife to do any of those things with it, because you've got a better knife and a better corkscrew, and a much better screwdriver that doesn't like mangle your hand every time you slip off the screw. So this is hydrogen as an energy tool. It's like the Swiss Army knife. It's expensive, it's bulky, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Maybe you'll resort to it in an emergency, but that's it. It's perfect. It's the perfect analogy.
But the greatest thing about that is that it's also easy enough to understand that people who don't dive into the science can run with the idea and go on stages, global stages, and tell this is future, right? Because there's
a lot of memification of information in this age, where people have an attention span of about 5 seconds because of their phone, right? Okay, you can blame the lithium-ion battery for that too. It enabled the destruction of human attention. But anyway, whatever. The thing is that there's a lot of memification of information, and the hydrogen people have been super good at it. So the Swiss Army knife business and the colors of hydrogen, which is another, pile of total crap. These colors of hydrogen, there is only one color of hydrogen. 98.7% of the hydrogen in the world is blacker than black. It's black hole black, okay? It's 30% blacker in CO2 emissions per joule of energy than the fossils it was made from. And it might be 50% worse or 70% worse, depending on what you make it out of. So, and depending on whether you take the methane emissions into account as well. And so there is no green hydrogen in the world. That's an idea. That's something you can do if you can find a way to afford it one day. But the reality is almost all the hydrogen in the world, like to the point of basically all the hydrogen in the world, is made from fossils without carbon capture. So this colors business is just obfuscation. And the same thing is true, like I said, with the Swiss Army knife analogy. So smart people have to learn how to memify things. And so I memified this whole hydrogen thing. I've got a Drake meme, and I live in Toronto, so Drake, he doesn't live very far from me. Although he's got a much nicer house than I do. But anyway, in the one picture, Drake's going like this, and it says hydrogen as a fuel. Drake goes like this. And then the next one, Drake's going like this, and it says, green hydrogen to replace black hydrogen. And it's that simple. Hydrogen as a fuel, oh, bad idea. But green hydrogen to replace black hydrogen, that's awesome. That's what we need to be focusing on, because we need that to live.